Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Ohio Choral Directors Association Masterclass Portfolio Series. My name is Dr. Felicia Barber, and I'm coming to you from Westfield State University, where I am the Director of Choral Activities. Tonight, I will be speaking to you on the topic of a new perspective of the dialect found in African American spirituals. This has been a source of my research for the past 10 years, and I am excited to announce that I do have my first book that was just published by Rowan and Littlefield in October of 2021, and I'll share more about that at the end of this presentation. So without further ado, I think it's time for us to go ahead and get started. I would like to start this by thanking Dr. Emily Brown for the kind invitation, and I'm so excited to share my research with you this evening. So as I said, this research started for me actually at Florida State University, where I was in the doctoral program there. And I have continued to do research over the past 10 years, specifically on the dialect that's found in spiritual contexts. So if you would, take a second and close your eyes and just listen to two examples that are going to be on the screen shortly. But take a minute, relax from being at work. Hopefully you'll have a nice time, get a glass of water, and just close your eyes and listen to the first example. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God is going to trouble the water. Now listen to the second example. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. You can open your eyes now. And so, of course, I sang those two examples for you. But the first example, if you noted, had no dialect reflected in the text. And so if you look on your screen, you can see that I sang water with a strong T and R. I had the water instead of the water or softened D. Children, we sang in its entirety. And then probably what was most troubling to your ear was the phrase, God is going to trouble. And so if you look with the dialect reflected in the next example, you'll see I have softened the THs to D. So you have the water. The T in the water is softened to a D, and the R is actually changed to what we would call a schwa if we were using IPA, or the sound as in the word about. So we have water. And then children has what's called consonant cluster reduction. That's just a form of deletion, actually in the middle of the word. And so we see that the D and the R have been deleted, leaving us chillin'. And the contraction in the second verse or second section of the song, where we have God's gonna, God is going to has been shortened to that contraction, and it softens it all the way through. And so when we're thinking about the dialect, specifically AAE, which is African American English, we want to think of an overall softening primarily of the consonants, and that's done by either consonant replacement or consonant deletion. And when I started my research, I started with this quote, and this is a quote from James Weldon Johnson, who we will talk more about later in this presentation. And he stated, for the proper rendition of any music, a knowledge of what was the intention of its creator is invaluable to the interpreter. And so for me, that was so invaluable as well. I wanted to make sure that I was looking at the early performance practice and seeing what I could figure out was the early intention of the performers as well as the arrangers and composers of this genre and style. So where do we go from here? Let's talk about what we will go over or review this evening. In my research, I primarily identify the languages and dialects established by African Americans in the United States. Also, I document the variety of dialects and languages used as a text source for spirituals. Another important point, of this is to actually document the role of early performance practice, specifically through the analysis of written scores as well as early recordings. And then I identify those features that were used most frequently through the analysis to help inform our current practice. Finally, I give some suggestions to teachers as you're getting ready to actually perform this or teach it to your students. So we have to begin at the beginning with the slave trade and looking at the three primary ports where African Americans were transported through the triangular trade. Specifically in the United States, that would be Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, and of course, New Orleans, Louisiana. Those are also the three primary areas where languages developed in those same communities. And I do want to stop for just a second and just talk a little bit about a few terms that we will discuss this evening, specifically Pidgin, Creole, and dialect. So a Pidgin is a language that is formed by at least two or more communities that have come together primarily for commerce. And once a Pidgin has been created and established for several years, it becomes a Creole dialect. A Creole language. And then you can have substandards of that language, which are referred to as dialects. So in the United States, we often refer to it as Standard American English. Although we have Southern States English, we have a New England accent, you have a Midwestern accent, all of those are dialects of English. Of course, we have English spoken in Britain, English spoken in Australia. Those are all forms or dialects of English, so that we have an understanding of that. And when we talk about the slave populations and those three areas of the country in which languages developed, we want to look at the Louisiana Creole, of course, in Louisiana. And then we have the Gullah language, which was primarily in the South Carolina, Charleston area, as well as the Georgia Sea Islands in northern Florida. And then we also have what I refer to as AAE, African American English, which is a dialect of African Americans throughout the country that was started in the South. And so first with the Louisiana Creole, that's a mixture of African French, Spanish, and English. And we do have a collection of African American spirituals that feature this specific language. If you look at Before the War Spirituals collection from 1933, I will mention that I know that you're watching this via satellite, but I have provided a handout for you. So as you're going through, you can mark some of these resources if you're interested in further research or in getting them yourself. So this is one that you'll find on page 4. In the collection, which I have made for you under the different languages. And I've also noted, again, if they reflect AAE, Louisiana Creole, or Gullah. I just wanted to point that out before we went on any further. Next, Gullah language, which usually for a lot of people is harder to understand. And that is because it's a mixture of African and English, but it has more African vocabulary than most people are used to. And so it's hard for English speakers to understand. That is still spoken today, primarily in South Carolina, in the Charleston area, as well as the Georgia Sea Islands. You can find some Gullah texts reflected in slave songs of the United States, which I'm going to talk a lot about in just a second when we talk about AAE. That was published in 1867. But also there are other collections. I particularly would like to point out the collection of Gullah lyrics to Carolina Low Country from 2007, as well as Spirituals of Carolina Low Country from 2004. Both of those were created in Charleston, South Carolina, and you actually need to contact the Chamber of Commerce to purchase those. But those are wonderful resources, and they also come with a recording. Just to give you an idea of what the Gullah language would look like, this is an excerpt from those two collections that I just spoke of. And you can see in the first column, we have the Gullah language or text. In the second column, I gave you some translation to what those words would be in English, and underline especially some words or vocabulary that is not in the English language. So I'm going to give you just a second to look at those two and compare. Again, this would be sung or spoken still to this day in Charleston, South Carolina, and in the Georgia Sea Islands, as well as northern coastal Florida. All right. Moving on to AAE, which is, I will refer to the rest of the evening, African American English. That is important because the majority of spiritual arrangements that we are used to singing in the concert spiritual tradition reflect AAE, or African American English. So it's the dialect of English. And again, I would like to point out at this time the strong correlation between AAE and Southern States English. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the sociolinguistic impact. But that's important to note. So as I mentioned before, Slave Songs of the United States, this is a great place to start if you are really interested in the spiritual genre. This resource has over 150 spirituals. They were collected all throughout the South by 3 transcribers, 1 woman and 2 men. The collection was published in 1867, and it has a lot of detail. There's single line melodies. So again, if you're looking at different concert spirituals, you can see the original single line melody that many of these spirituals that we sing in our classrooms or perform on stage have been based on. Great resource. You can still get it. You can get it online, and it's less than $20. So I really recommend that as a place to start if you're looking into spirituals. So just again to review the language areas, so you're knowing the AAE would be throughout in purple, Gullah language primarily in the Charleston, South Carolina, and Georgia Sea Islands, as well as northern Florida, and then of course Louisiana Creole in Louisiana. It's important to note that 90%, and I'll repeat that, 90% of African Americans still lived in a concentrated area in the South, and that's why AAE dialect is so prevalent, and you can still see traces of it in culture today. Some people can talk about it as the predecessor to things like Ebonics or Urban English, and so when I point out some of these shifts, phonological features, I'll also reference some things that still are used in speech today. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the linguistic aspect. And I started this research linguistically because I wanted to give us a new perspective due to the perception, and a lot of times negative perception, that is on the dialect itself, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So I wanted to start thinking about it linguistically. If we approach this dialect linguistically, we note that in linguistics, that all language is equal. And that's a truism that I'll restate throughout the evening, but all language is equal. And so here, I'm going to start with some of the things that we find maybe in older spirituals, which have heavier dialect reflected. Sometimes we have different spellings. You can look here, I have the word heaven, children, and religion, and you might see those as heaven, hebben, or hebim. Children could be chillin, chiln, children, with some deletion or more or less deletion there. Religion could be ligion, or religion. And note that, again, in all of these, it's they're using standard American English or the alphabet, 26 letters, to try to reflect what was being sung or performed. So there are inconsistencies and some ambiguity, and it sometimes leads to frustration by performers and also teachers. One of the reasons why I'm so adamant about giving you the information in IPA is because we know, of course, IPA, there is only one sound for each symbol. And so we don't have the issue like point 3 of this slide, where an E could be an E sound, and E can also be the as in let, or it could be silent as in the word phone. So it's able to have a sound per symbol, and that's so important. So when I started my research, I really looked at 2 ways of analyzing this to try to establish early performance practice. I looked at early scores, and the earliest transcriptions in the 1830s, but again, our first collection didn't come till 1867. And then sound recordings, the earliest sound recording that I listened to was 1893 from the Library of Congress. When I started I also looked at researchers of the time, and I told you we were going to come back to James Weldon Johnson, and that is true. James Weldon Johnson was a leader at the turn of the century and a leader in the during Harlem Renaissance movement. And he was not only someone that was known for his leadership, political leadership, but also his brother was a musician. And if you know the song Lift Every Voice, which is the African-American anthem, he actually wrote the lyrics to that, and his brother wrote the music. So if you hadn't heard of James Weldon Johnson, at least you have that reference. He also wrote several essays on African-American music, and specifically the spiritual. And he wrote essays on the topics of dialect, also spiritual types. He wrote on swing in the spiritual, harmony as well, and also feeling, rhythm, and interpretation. And if you're interested in seeing where his essays are, they're in the prefaces of a couple of different books. The Autobiography of the Ex-Colored Man, published in 1912. He also has these essays in the beginning of a collection that was edited by his and arranged by his brother. And that also is on page 4 of your collection series. That's the Books of American Negro Spirituals, published in 1925. And that essay is there as well. And finally, Along This Way, published in 1933. All 3 of those books have his essays on spirituals in the beginning or preface of the books. So I know this chart is hard to read. So let us look at this next sheet. And this kind of breaks down what he goes over in relation to dialect in those essays. And so we have here the TH, which I've talked about before, softening, or in our first example that was sung, the TH being softened to a T or D. Now, in the islands, often you will hear that TH turn to a D as part of the African diaspora. But in the United States, more often than not, it's softened to a D. So there would become dares, with would become wid, and death would become det. So there we see a T, but more often than not, we do see the D, and especially at the beginning of the words, we see it softened to a D. He also referenced the use of the R, shifting to the schwa that we talked about earlier. So butter would become butter. And then he did reference vowels, although, as I said earlier, most of the rules that I review as well have to do with consonants. There are a few rules. The E and the U between 2 consonants become an sound or an sound. So that was the only one reference specifically about the vowels. So now let's look at the analysis in scores. And again, I looked at things all the way back to 1830. Our first collection of spirituals from 1867. Here's a couple of other notable collections. These, again, are on that collections page. So if you want to mark any of these. Religious folk songs of the Negro as sung by Hampton Institute. I had an opportunity to go to Hampton and look through their library as well. This was originally published in 1874. There also is Religious Folk Songs of the Negro as sung at Hampton Institute and edited by R. Nathaniel Dett. Now, he is one of our great arrangers of concert spirituals. He also was a choral director, hyped up choral director. I'm doing hands in the air, at Hampton Institute. And so I do want to, for just a second, thank and credit the work of the choral directors at HBCUs, that's historically Black colleges, that helped to bring this genre to the forefront. And through touring of their university ensembles, and specifically also by arranging a lot of this music and single line melodies for their ensembles. So this is one of the cases here with R. Nathaniel Dett. And I would recommend, if you're going to get this collection, that you get the 1927 edition, which has arrangements by R. Nathaniel Dett, as well as some original compositions in that collection. Another collection, and I've already mentioned it, was the 1925 collection by J. Rosemond Johnson, the Book of American Negro Spirituals. So let's start at the beginning. Here is Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Had, which most of us know as Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. And here you can see I've underlined some of the changes that were made. So this is from the 1867 collection. You can see that the THs were all changed to D. So we have the trouble throughout. And then even in verse 2 and 3 at the bottom, you still have those changed to D. We have something we haven't talked about yet, and that's called a prefixing. That is adding the sound to the beginning of the word, but it could be a suffixing as well, ending up at the end. And we'll see some examples of that later in this presentation. And then we also have deletion or consonant cluster reduction, which we have talked about earlier. And again, that is, in this instance, ground becoming ground. And you'll see that in the third verse. Again, this is that original collection, so you can see where each spiritual was collected, and they give further information at the bottom. That's the collection I was encouraging you all to start with. I also looked at several arrangers and highlighted these three. H.T. Burleigh, who of course we know influenced Dvorak's appreciation for the spiritual. R. Nathaniel Dett, who I just spoke of, who was a director at Hampton Institute in Virginia, and William Dawson, who was also director at Tuskegee. And most people, if you haven't heard of the three, you probably have heard or performed a William Dawson arrangement. So I'm going to start here with an analysis of a Burleigh piece. This is from 1922, and this is The Gospel Train is Coming. I know this is a hard score to see online, so I have put the text of the score here to the side. So you see, in every line, there is some form of dialect reflected. We have The Gospel Train is a coming. I hear it just, so we have, again, the D's throughout the gospel, the car, the lamb. We have the consonant cluster reduction or deletion, primarily at the word final, at the ends of words, so just becomes just. Hand becomes han, and becomes an, and land becomes land. And notice again, consonant cluster reduction just means when you have more than at least two consonants in a row, that one of them primarily will be deleted. And then we also have that a prefixing that I just talked about, a coming, but we also have here a form of deletion where the ng is changed into an n. And you'll notice every time that that change occurs, that the vowel before it is also changed. So instead of a coming, we have a come in. And so we go from an e vowel to an I vowel. That happens again here in rumbling and rolling. This is the collection, just to let you know, of significant spirituals. You have this on page 4, and you can be marking these as we're going through and looking at collections. Now let's look briefly at how dialect was reflected in sound. And in this instance, I actually did a few things. I started with historically Black colleges and many of their collegiate ensembles and quartets. I also looked at professional ensembles of the time. I listened to research studies at the Library of Congress, specifically the Robert Winslow Gordon Research Collection, Hampton Institute Research Collection, and the Mississippi Delta Collection. And so to start, I would actually like us to start with the Tuskegee Singers from 1914, and you're going to listen for 3 specific things. Forms of deletion in the words, see if you can hear a prefixing, and then replacement of the TH to the D. Now, as we're listening, I want to actually go to the next page here, and I have the same song up, but now you can see what I heard transcribed with Standard American English, and then again the changes from IPA, and you can see if your ear agrees. All right, so we had a lot of different changes there. I'm going to start right in order with the TH first changing to the D. We see it throughout in the second system and also the third section of the text. We have destari and dares changing with that TH. We also have a lot of consonant cluster reduction, and becoming an, don't becoming don't, behind becoming behind. We also have deletion within a word and also replacement. So heaven becomes hebim, and the V is softened to a B. That happens a lot. And then the N is even softened to an M here for hebim. We also have the a prefixing, but in the form of suffixing. So we have wanta, leva. So both of those would be a suffixing. And I think we've covered everything else. Either it's another form of deletion. Oh, and then coming, it becomes coming. So we have again that NG changing to the N and also changing our vowel from the E vowel to the I vowel. So with the collections, again, these are the collections, and this is the areas they were collected in Robert Winslow Gordon collection that was at the Library of Congress. That again was from the Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee area from 1922 to 1932. Hampton Institute study, 1937 to 1942 in Virginia. And then the Mississippi Delta and Fisk research collection from 1938 to 1942, and those were in the areas of Mississippi and Virginia. And I will say that these collections, what was so interesting is they had full church services, they had individual choirs, they had professional choirs, they had individual singing, they had individuals talking, there were interviews, and so it was a lot of different venues and experiences of the spiritual that was recorded. And it was interesting to note what was happening. And throughout, I was hearing dialect reflected. This is from the Robert Winslow Gordon collection. This is going to be hard to hear, but this is a cylinder recording that I got from that collection, and that was transferred into digital. And this is one of the hardest examples I'm going to share with you. But this is an individual singing Glory, Glory, Hallelujah as part of that collection.
On cylinder A, 204, we heard Some of These Days. This is continued on cylinder A, 205, with the same performer, and it is evidently the same performance.
Glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Some of these days. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Some of these days. I'm gonna read that welcome table. I'm going to read at the welcome table some of these days. I'm going to read at the welcome table. I'm going to read at the welcome table some of these days.
All right. And so if we look again at this area, you can see again deletion throughout. Another thing that I haven't spoke of yet related to the vowel is the idea of the diphthongs becoming monophthongs. So we have glory instead of, here we have vowel replacement. Instead of glory, we have glory. We have some of these days. So we have the A suffixing again. TH changing to a D, so D's and duh throughout. I do want to note that the contraction going to becomes going to. I did notice, depending on the area in the South that spirituals were collected, sometimes instead of the contraction changing to gonna, it would have gointa or gonta. So that was, again, depending on the area. And here again, we have this contraction changing, but it also has a suffixing in with the at the end. Now, I want to just kind of look at my research findings and through the analysis of the two, specifically listening through written scores as well as analysis of recordings. So I just shared with you a couple of examples, not all of the examples that I went through. And here is a list of the top 16. In my book, I have a more detailed listing of vowels and consonants. But here you can see some of the ones that were more prevalent that we've already discussed this evening. TH for number 1, changing to the D. Number 3 in that list, the R, in this case being deleted, so 4 becoming full. Remember, the treatment of the R often is either complete deletion or it would be switched into a schwa, the sound. Point 6 in that list is consonant cluster reduction that we've been talking about throughout the evening, especially at the word final again. So child becomes child. Something we haven't spoken about yet is point 7, and that is the deletion of a initial or medial unstressed syllable. So it could be a whole syllable. We have, in this case, I used away becoming way, but you could have the word because becoming cause. And so that unstressed syllable would be deleted. We've already talked about 8 and 9 with the NG changing to the N for that. I want to scoot down to number 15, which was what I had just about to start on our last example, and that's the idea of the diphthong becoming the monophthong. So instead of wide, we have wad. And then we've already talked about a prefixing or a suffixing, so a come in or inna, depending on where the sound is turned to. Again, I just wanted to do a shout out to the historically Black colleges, specifically Fisk Jubilee singers who started in the 1860s traveling. They're actually having an anniversary this year and are producing an album. They're fantastic, from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. But this is a picture circa 1870 of the original singers who traveled and brought this genre not only throughout the United States, but through the world, singing even for Queen Victoria. So with that, let's listen to a few more examples and see how you're doing on picking up some of these features. We're going to start with a 1919 recording of the Fisk Singers. And in this, Ezekiel saw the wheel. I just want you to try and see if you can see the softening of the TH to the D.
In the middle of the air, Ezekiel saw the wheel. Way in the middle of the air, the big wheel moved by faith, the little wheel moved by the grace of God. A wheel and a wheel. Way in the middle of the air, oh yes, Ezekiel saw the wheel.
So you can hear it right there from that opening, Ezekiel saw the wheel. Here in the next example, example 2, I want you, this time we're going to listen for consonant cluster reduction. I'm going to point out 2 words where it happens, but there are others. For instance, want becomes wan, so the T is softened to the N and deleted. And then the word Jerusalem becomes Jerualem. This is the Excelsior Quartet. About the same time period, 1922, they were a professional ensemble.
I'll be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Up, down, down. To walk in Jerusalem just like John. Almost never to the crowd. To walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John.
All right, so hopefully you heard that Wam and Jerusalem that had the medial deletion happening in the middle of the word. Example 3 we actually listened to earlier, so we're going to move on. I want to see if you can figure out how to do some of this implementation. So just for a second, let's look together at the chorus, just the chorus, the top line. Let's take a minute. Normally I do this in live presentations and give everyone an example to do a transfer task and work with their neighbor. But in this instance, why don't you take a minute and just look at the chorus? And I only want you thinking about 3 of the 16 things that we went over. And so first, see if in that chorus line you can see where there's any THs that can be softened to a D. The next one, I want you to look for consonant cluster reduction, specifically at the word final. So remember words like and, changing to an or softening to an. That's when you have more than 2 consonants at the end of the word. And then 8 and 9, see if there's any places where you can change the NG ending to an N. So I'm going to give you just a minute, and then I'll come back and we will look through the chorus. So just looking through this, we have the battle, which will change to the battle, and that happens twice. And then near the end of the sentence, you have the walls. And then we have, for our next one, point 6, which is consonant cluster reduction. If we look throughout, we do have the word and near the end of that sentence, first line, that we're going to change to an. That's an example of consonant cluster reduction near the end of the word. And then point 8 and 9, just looking to see if we can change an NG. We only have the NG and the word tumbling, and it will become tumbling. I do want to point out, even though we didn't do it, verse 1, you do have king of Gideon. That actually would stay king because it's a noun. So you're looking at those verbs that you would be changing that NG, for instance. Now, we are going to move on just because of time for this, but just to give you an idea of what is in the book, I look at 10 or take 10 really popular features, and then I give you my recommendations for them in English, standard American English, and then with IPA. And so this is just with an example of a few of them in them, but that's part of the book that just was released. And here it is. I also have one here in person. I'm doing a hint of promotion. So the book, just to give you an idea, it covers the historical analysis and acquisition of languages in chapter 2, and then goes through 3 chapters of establishing performance practice through some of the stuff that we discussed tonight, but just touched on, looking at early researchers, looking at the early arrangers and written scores, and then an analysis of recordings. I do a trace history in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is looking at the phonological features and actually giving you recommendations. And that's where I have the 10 most popular spiritual texts, and I actually give recommendations for you. I also let you know many of the arrangers of that piece and some publishers, so give you some information there. And then chapter 8, we finish with moving forward with a discussion with 9 prominent arrangers of spirituals of how they approach the use of dialect as they're getting ready to arrange their pieces. I do want to touch on this point of sociolinguistics, and that's where I start this book at. Again, remember, I started with the idea of the truism that all language is equal. And I think that one of the important things that we have to do as educators and performers of this genre is to make sure that we are communicating some of the sociolinguistic issues associated with the use of dialect. So AAE has a negative connotation to it because of its association with slavery. We have to recognize that the language itself, the dialect itself, was weaponized. And to give you a great example of this, through the use of minstrelsy in the late 1800s or throughout the 1800s, and where the language was used as mockery, as a way to denigrate and to try to put down our people, my people. And so we cannot go away from that. But again, we want to say that all language is equal. So living in the United States, living in a culture that is a dominant language ideology, that means that they believe that standard American English is here and all other languages and dialects are subservient or inferior. And so we have to get over that to the actual truth, which is all languages are equal and all languages are beautiful. And so in going with that lens and approaching the dialect use. The reason I feel like dialect use is so significant is because it really changes the color of the sound. When I'm singing Wade in the Water, if I say God is going to trouble, God is going to trouble, God's gonna trouble. Those are 2 different sounds and context of that same song. And so to note that the softening, the overall softening is significant. Just like if I was doing something in German, I would do my best to do performance practice of German diction. Or if I was doing something in French, I would do my due diligence as well to give proper interpretation and also proper pronunciation of that dialect. Here, because it has been associated with slavery and because it has been weaponized, we have to actually have a conversation with our performers and our audiences, I dare say, to let them know why we are using the dialect, why it's important to use it. And again, my major professor talked about, people should use it with their own as they're comfortable. Don't just put in something just because you think it should sound that way. Use the research I've provided for you to help you inform you on how to work and interpret the current genre as you're looking at spirituals that are from earlier periods and earlier arrangers, as well as modern arrangers. A lot of modern arrangers, or many modern arrangers, have started putting dialect reflected back in. I did note a correlation with 1960, where early arrangers, there was a ton of reflection of dialect throughout. And then around 1960s, around the same time the Civil Rights Movement, you notice a dropping off of publishers publishing it, but at the same time, recording still reflected it. And so we've started kind of swinging back to publishers including that, and some arrangers including that in their spiritual notes. So again, make sure you use the research, make sure you're doing things that are correct to the practice, and also make sure that you're having that discussion with your students and with your audiences as well. I love coming to speak to and helping to clinic through if people are performing this genre, but my goal with this was to give you as educators and you as performers tools so that you felt more equipped in approaching the genre itself. I'm hopeful that the book will be a help to all of you. But again, I just kind of talked through these sociolinguistic issues. Finally, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. I really wanted this again to be a help to teachers and performers, and I'm really hopeful that this will serve to inform your current practice. If you have any questions or would like further information, there is my information. If you actually would like to order the book, and specifically a signed copy of the book is also eligible on my Rowan and Littlefield, but it's also available on my website, and that's right there, drfeliciabarber.com.